When I first moved back to the old family property tucked deep in the foothills, I thought I had finally escaped the noise of the city and the constant nagging of people who believe they had the right to control others' lives. But little did I know that fate was about to place me squarely in the path of one of the most insufferable women I have ever met, a woman I would come to know only as HOA Karen. The land had been in my family for generations, and though the cabin had seen better days, I was determined to restore it to the way my grandfather once had it, surrounded by tall pines, the steady hum of cicadas in the summer, and the gentle sound of the creek that cut across the property. A creek that was more than just a picturesque feature. It was the lifeblood of the area, feeding into irrigation channels, keeping livestock hydrated, and even serving as the primary water source for the nearby housing development that had sprung up during my years away. When I first met the neighbors from that development, they made it clear that the Homeowners Association ran things with an iron fist, and at the center of it all was Karen, the self proclaimed queen bee, who believed every square inch of land within shouting distance should bend to her authority. My first run in with her came just 2 weeks after I moved in, when I was repairing the sagging fence line near the road. She rolled up in a gleaming SUV, window down, her sunglasses perched on the tip of her nose as she peered at me like I was some intruder trespassing on sacred ground. And without so much as a greeting, she launched into a tirade about how unsightly my cabin looked, how my woodpile was stacked incorrectly, and how the HOA has standards that I apparently needed to follow. I told her, politely at first, that my land wasn't part of their HOA, that my deed predated their entire subdivision, and that the only standards I followed were the county's ordinances. But Karen didn't take kindly to being corrected. She gave me that thin-lipped smile people use when they're trying to hide their fury, muttered something about, "We'll see about that," and drove off in a huff, tires spitting gravel as she left. Over the next month, little inconveniences began to pile up. Letters left in my mailbox with friendly reminders about lawn maintenance, phone calls from county offices about anonymous complaints, and strangers showing up to inspect my property without notice. It was obvious Karen was behind it, testing me, pushing to see how far she could exert her HOA's reach. I might have let it slide, chalked it up to nosy neighbor behavior. If not for the day, I came down to the creek and found something that made my blood boil. The water wasn't flowing the way it usually did, the current was sluggish, choked, and when I followed the sound of trickling upstream, I found Karen and two of her cronies standing on my side of the creek, dumping shovels of gravel into the waterway like it was their personal construction project. I shouted, demanding to know what they thought they were doing, and Karen, with her usual smirk, told me they were stabilizing the creek bed to prevent erosion that might affect her subdivision, claiming the HOA had voted on it and decided it was necessary. I told her again, more forcefully this time, that this was my land, my creek, and they had no right to alter it, but she waved me off like I was a pesky child and told me that since the creek benefited everyone, it was subject to community improvement projects. That night, I barely slept, pacing the cabin floor as I thought about what she'd done. Because it wasn't just about gravel in a stream, it was about her trying to stake a claim on something that had been in my family for decades, and if I didn't push back hard, she would only get bolder. Over the following week, the problem became worse. The gravel pile they had dumped acted like a dam, diverting water in strange directions, silting up the clear channels, and causing parts of my land to flood while downstream the subdivision's irrigation system received less and less flow. Karen, of course, denied responsibility, insisting that if anything, my poor land management was to blame, and she even had the audacity to suggest that the HOA might fine me for causing a disruption to their water access. That was the moment I realized I wasn't just dealing with a pushy neighbor. I was dealing with someone who thrived on control, who weaponized bureaucracy and intimidation to get her way, and I knew then that if I didn't take a stand, she'd walk all over me until there was nothing left of the land or the peace I'd come home to find. My grandfather used to say, "Sometimes you don't need to fight fire with fire. You fight arrogance with patience and stupidity with consequences." So I decided to watch, to document, and to plan, because Karen had just set in motion a chain of events she couldn't even begin to understand, and though she thought she was suffocating me with gravel, she was really digging her own hole one shovelful at a time. In the days that followed, I made it my mission to observe everything that woman and her little HOA army did around the creek, because if Karen was bold enough to trespass and start dumping gravel on my land once, she'd surely try again, and I needed proof that would stand up not only in front of the county, but also in any potential courtroom. So, every morning I walked the creek bed with my camera, snapping photos of the water levels, the shifting gravel, and the muddy floods creeping farther into my pastures. I noted the times and dates, filed them in a binder, and even set up a small trail camera hidden in the trees that overlooked the spot where they had first begun their so-called stabilization project. The footage I captured over that week was as infuriating as it was vindicating. Karen, in her designer boots that were more suited for shopping mall than the outdoors, barking orders at two HOA volunteers as they carted wheelbarrows of stone down from a truck parked illegally on my easement. Sometimes they dumped the gravel straight into the current, other times they shoveled it into makeshift berms along the banks, which only redirected the flow even more chaotically. I wanted to storm out there, to yell, to physically drag them off my land, but I knew that would only play into Karen's narrative of me being unstable or uncooperative. So I held my tongue, clenched my fists, and reminded myself of my grandfather's words: consequences. The funny thing was, Karen was so blinded by her arrogance that she didn't even realize the immediate consequences were already unfolding. Downstream in her precious subdivision, the lawns that once gleamed like golf courses began to wither, the HOA's ornamental pond turned murky and shallow, and residents started filing complaints at their own meetings about low water pressure in their houses. My neighbor Tom, who lived on the edge of the subdivision and wasn't exactly fond of Karen either, confided in me that the HOA board was growing restless with her little creek project because it was costing them money without any visible benefit. Apparently, Karen had pushed the narrative that my land was leaking water and that the gravel fix was the only solution, but the more they shoveled, the worse things became, and the angrier her fellow homeowners grew. Of course, she couldn't admit fault, not Karen. Instead, she doubled down, insisting that I was sabotaging their efforts, that I must have been digging trenches or diverting the creek behind their backs. One evening, just as the sun was dipping low and casting golden light across the water, I caught her red-handed, wading into the creek with a rake, trying to scrape the gravel into a more controlled dam, as if she could micromanage a waterway like she micromanaged her neighbor's flower beds. I filmed the whole thing from a distance, the rake catching on rocks, her muttering curses under her breath, and when she finally spotted me with the camera, the fury in her eyes could have boiled the creek dry. She marched up the bank, dripping wet and livid, demanding that I delete the footage immediately, waving her hands and spitting threats about lawsuits and fines. I didn't flinch. I just told her calmly that trespassing and altering waterways without permits was illegal, that I had every right to film her on my land, and that if she wanted to escalate this into a legal battle, I was more than ready. She sputtered, called me a backwoods squatter, and stormed off, but the damage was done. She knew I had evidence, and worse for her, I knew she was scared of it. What she didn't realize, however, was that her own community was now my greatest ally, even if they didn't know it yet. Every bag of groceries that had to be carried in because the irrigation ditches were drying up, every dead patch of grass in their manicured lawns, every complaint about cloudy tap water, it all traced back to Karen's little stunt at my creek. I could almost taste the irony, because in her attempt to fix what she insisted was my problem, she had created the HOA's biggest headache, and they were looking to her for answers she didn't have. Still, I wasn't ready to reveal my hand. I wanted to let the pressure build, let the cracks in her facade widen until the whole rotten structure collapsed on its own. So I kept documenting, kept gathering proof, and when the county water inspector finally came out after multiple complaints from the subdivision, I was ready. He walked the property with me, looked at the gravel dam, shook his head, and muttered about violations of environmental codes and potential fines. He took his own photos, measurements, and water samples, all while I stood by with my binder of evidence. Before leaving, he told me quietly, "Don't worry, this isn't on you. It's on whoever decided to play amateur engineer with a natural creek." I couldn't help but grin, because I already knew exactly who that was, and soon the entire HOA would know too. Karen thought she could bully me into submission, thought she could take my land and twist it to her will, but she had just started a fight with nature itself, and nature has a way of humbling even the most arrogant. What she didn't realize was that the creek wasn't just my property's charm, it was its power, and she had tampered with something she couldn't control. I walked back to the cabin that evening feeling lighter than I had in weeks, because for the first time since her SUV had rolled down my road, I knew I wasn't the one on the defensive anymore. The creek would speak for itself, and Karen was about to learn the hard way that you can't outsmart water, and you sure as hell can't bury consequences under gravel. By the time the county inspector's report began making its way through the bureaucratic channels, the subdivision was already on the verge of open revolt against Karen, though of course she couldn't see it, or rather, she refused to admit it, because to admit it would mean acknowledging her mistake, and that was something Karen simply wasn't wired to do. The creek was now a shadow of what it once was, clogged in places with gravel mounds that sent the current skittering off into shallow pools where mosquitoes bred, while downstream the flow into the HOA's irrigation pond had slowed to a pitiful trickle. Residents who had once prided themselves on their magazine-worthy lawns were watching helplessly as the grass turned brown, flower beds wilted, and ornamental trees leaned under the weight of heat stress, and all the while Karen spun excuse after excuse to keep herself blameless. First, she told them it was a drought, though the truth was anyone could see the mountains had sent more runoff than usual that year, and the upstream flow outside my property line was still strong and steady. Then she claimed I had sabotaged the creek intentionally, diverting it through some hidden system of trenches to starve their community of water, and she even had the gall to present this wild theory at one of their HOA meetings, banging her gavel and insisting that my so-called noncompliance with community needs was a deliberate attack. But the residents weren't buying it anymore. I heard whispers from Tom and a few others that homeowners had begun recording her rants, passing around evidence of her obsession, and more than one had started digging into the legal boundaries of the HOA itself, realizing that they had no jurisdiction over my land whatsoever. The funny thing was, while Karen was busy trying to paint me as the villain, I hadn't actually lifted a finger beyond collecting evidence. I didn't have to, because the creek itself was the perfect witness, exposing her interference every single day as the water dwindled and her neighbors grew more restless. Still, I knew the storm was coming, and I wanted to be ready for when the tipping point arrived, so I doubled down on my preparations. I printed copies of every photograph, every video still, every page of the inspector's notes, and tucked them into neatly labeled folders that I kept ready to hand out at a moment's notice. I even made a map of the creek, marking the exact spots where the gravel had been dumped and showing the downstream impact, a clear line connecting Karen's meddling to the subdivision's misery. I didn't have to wait long for the opportunity to use it. One evening, Tom stopped by my cabin with a grim smile and told me Karen had scheduled an emergency HOA meeting to address the water crisis, and word had it she planned to drag my name through the mud as the scapegoat. He suggested I attend not as a member, because I wasn't one, but as a concerned property owner and the actual landholder of the creek. At first, I hesitated, knowing Karen would explode at the sight of me in what she considered her domain, but then I realized there was no better way to corner her than by showing up with the truth in my hands. So, the following Saturday, I cleaned up, packed my folders, and walked into that meeting hall like I belonged there. The reaction was immediate. Heads turned, whispers rippled through the crowd, and Karen's face went pale before twisting into a mask of fury as she banged her gavel and shouted that this was a private HOA matter and that I had no right to be present. But the residents were tired of her theatrics, and several voices rose up at once telling her to let me speak. One even shouted, "If he owns the creek, he has every right to be here," and the room erupted in agreement. Cornered, Karen tried to regain control, muttering about bylaws and procedures, but her authority was crumbling faster than the gravel dam she had built. I stepped up to the front, laid out my folders, and began calmly presenting the evidence. Photos of her trespassing, videos of her dumping gravel, documentation from the inspector's citing violations, and maps showing exactly how her meddling had choked off their water supply. The room grew silent except for the rustle of papers and the occasional gasp when a particularly damning photo was passed around. Karen sputtered, tried to interrupt, called the evidence doctored, but by then the crowd wasn't buying it. They had lived the consequences of her actions, and the truth was staring them in the face. One homeowner stood up and demanded to know how much money the HOA had spent on Karen's project, and when the treasurer reluctantly admitted the figure, thousands of dollars diverted from the community fund, you could feel the mood shift from frustration to outright anger. Another resident shouted that Karen should resign, while a third demanded restitution for their dead landscaping. Karen, red-faced and trembling, tried to turn it back on me, screaming that I had set her up, that I had orchestrated this whole mess to make her look bad. But her voice was drowned out by a chorus of neighbors demanding accountability. For the first time, I saw something in her eyes I hadn't before. Not arrogance, not superiority, but fear. She realized she had lost control of the narrative, that her grip on the HOA was slipping, and she lashed out wildly, threatening lawsuits, calling people traitors, even pointing at me and saying she would make sure I paid for humiliating her. But the more she raged, the smaller she seemed, and by the end of the night, the board had voted to suspend her pending an investigation, stripping her of her gavel, and leaving her to storm out of the hall in disgrace. I walked home under the stars with a quiet satisfaction humming in my chest, because while the battle wasn't over, people like Karen don't go down without a fight. I had just landed a blow she couldn't easily recover from, and the creek, ever faithful, flowed gently beside me, whispering that justice was finally beginning to take shape. In the aftermath of that explosive HOA meeting, it seemed for a brief moment as though the nightmare might finally be over. But if I had learned anything about Karen by then, it was that she didn't know how to quit. Humiliation only made her more dangerous, like a cornered animal, and instead of retreating quietly after being stripped of her gavel, she doubled down on her vendetta against me. Within days of her suspension, I began noticing subtle but unmistakable signs of retaliation. Anonymous complaints filed against me with the county claiming I was running an unlicensed business out of my cabin, a suspiciously timed inspection notice from the fire department suggesting my chimney was a hazard, and even a strange letter left in my mailbox demanding that I remove a non-compliant structure from my yard, a shed that had been standing since before Karen's subdivision even existed. Each time, I dealt with the nonsense patiently, welcoming the inspectors, showing them my paperwork, and watching as they shook their heads and muttered about someone with too much time on their hands. It was aggravating, yes, but it also confirmed that Karen was panicking, scrambling to regain some sense of control now that her own community had turned against her. What she didn't realize was that her grip on the HOA had slipped beyond repair. Tom told me that homeowners were already talking about dissolving the entire board or at least rewriting the bylaws to strip it of power, and many were furious about the money wasted on the creek debacle. Still, Karen clung to the belief that if she could make my life miserable enough, I would cave, leave the land, and free her from the embarrassment she now carried like a scarlet letter. But what truly sealed her fate wasn't her petty harassment. It was her stubborn refusal to leave the creek alone. Despite being warned by the inspector and despite the community's outrage, she continued sneaking back onto my property under cover of night, dragging sacks of gravel and even broken chunks of concrete to pile into the waterway. The trail camera caught her more than once, and each new clip I added to my collection painted an even clearer picture of a woman obsessed, consumed by the idea that if she could just block or redirect enough of the water, she could prove her original point and salvage her reputation. But nature doesn't bend to ego, and the more she tampered, the more unpredictable the creek became. Heavy rains came in early spring, and the gravel berm she had built acted like a false dam, sending water rushing sideways into parts of the subdivision that were never meant to flood. Lawns turned into swamps, basements filled with muddy water, and one unlucky resident found their backyard pool filled with silt and debris after the creek burst its makeshift banks. The HOA board, already fractured and leaderless without Karen, scrambled to contain the fallout. But every solution they tried was undone by the root cause, Karen's meddling. Meanwhile, up at my cabin, I was safe on higher ground, watching from my porch as the natural flow of the creek tried to correct itself, pushing against the man-made barriers and carving new channels where it could. I almost felt sorry for the residents, many of whom had been innocent bystanders in Karen's war against me, but I couldn't ignore the poetic justice of the situation. Karen had wanted to control the water, to use it as a weapon against me, and instead it had turned on her and her entire community. When county officials returned to investigate the flooding, I handed over my growing library of evidence: photos, videos, maps, and now hours of footage showing Karen trespassing in the dead of night with wheelbarrows of rubble. The officials were stunned, muttering about violations of environmental law, property rights, and even potential criminal charges. They promised me the county prosecutor would be reviewing the case, and for the first time I saw a glimmer of accountability on the horizon. Still, Karen refused to back down. She showed up at my property one afternoon, uninvited, screaming at me from a road that I had ruined her life, that I had turned everyone against her with my lies, and that I would regret ever moving back to the cabin. Her face was flushed, her hands shook as she pointed at me like a villain in a play, and when I simply raised my camera and filmed her tirade, she shrieked like I had stabbed her. The irony was almost too much. This was the same woman who had strutted onto my land with her rake and gravel, convinced she was untouchable, and now she was reduced to raving at me from a roadside ditch, powerless and unraveling. The residents who once tiptoed around her now openly defied her. I overheard two of them at the general store calling her the Creek Witch and laughing about how she had single-handedly destroyed their water supply. Tom said petitions were circulating not just to permanently remove her from the HOA, but to ban her from holding any position of authority in the subdivision ever again. The tide had turned completely, and all I had done was shine a light on her actions and let nature take its course. But the real hammer was still to fall, because while Karen thought she was fighting me, what she had really picked a fight with was the law, and the law was about to answer her in a way she couldn't ignore. As I sat on my porch one evening, the creek murmuring in the background, I couldn't help but smile at the thought of what was coming next, because Karen was about to learn that when you fill a creek with gravel, you don't just block the water, you block yourself, and sooner or later, the flood comes for you. The flood of consequences that my grandfather had always warned about came crashing down on Karen with the force of a mountain storm, and once it started, there was no stopping it. The county prosecutor's office picked up the case after reviewing the inspector's reports and my evidence, and what began as a series of code violations quickly snowballed into a full-blown investigation into environmental damage, trespassing, and misuse of HOA funds. When the official notice was delivered to her pristine, white-trimmed house in the subdivision, I happened to be standing by the mailbox at the end of my property road, and I swear I could hear her shrieking from inside when she read it. Word spread quickly through the community, and before long, her neighbors were openly gossiping about the charges, shaking their heads at how far she had dragged them into her obsession. Many of them, burned by the wasted HOA money and the damages to their property, were more than willing to provide testimony, sharing their own stories of her late-night rants, her dictatorial leadership, and her reckless insistence on fixing the creek even after the inspector told her to stop. It was almost surreal watching the woman, who once acted like she controlled the entire valley, suddenly finding herself hemmed in on all sides by people she had bullied for years. I kept to myself, of course, letting the legal process run its course, but that didn't mean I wasn't paying attention. I attended every hearing, sat quietly in the back, and listened as the prosecutor laid out a case so airtight even Karen's bluster couldn't poke holes in it. The videos from my trail cameras played on the screen for all to see, showing her trudging across my property under the cover of darkness, her wheelbarrow squeaking, her boots sinking into the mud, her face illuminated by the beam of her flashlight as she dumped another load of gravel into the creek. She tried to deny it was her at first, but the footage was clear, and when the prosecutor presented her own HOA meeting minutes where she bragged about taking initiative with the waterway, the courtroom practically buzzed with disbelief at her arrogance. Her defense attorney scrambled to frame it as a misunderstanding, painting her as a community-minded volunteer who had only wanted to help, but that flimsy story collapsed under the weight of the actual damage. The flooded basements, the ruined landscaping, the county's calculation of the cost to restore the creek to its natural state. By the time the experts testified that her actions had caused measurable ecological harm, choking out fish habitats and altering the flow of runoff downstream, the judge's patience with her antics was visibly wearing thin. And yet, even in the face of mounting evidence, Karen couldn't stop herself. She interrupted witnesses, rolled her eyes at the judge, and at one point even tried to point the finger at me, claiming I had set her up, that I had somehow orchestrated the entire thing to make her look bad. The absurdity of it only made her seem more unhinged, and the more she ranted, the more her credibility evaporated. Meanwhile, back in the subdivision, the residents were working to rebuild their community in her absence, holding new elections, redirecting their funds toward repairing the irrigation system, and even floating the idea of dissolving the HOA altogether to avoid ever being under the thumb of another Karen again. Tom told me he hadn't seen neighbors this united in years, and he credited me for it, though I insisted all I had done was shine a light on the truth and let Karen dig her own grave with each shovelful of gravel. When the verdict finally came down, it was a mixture of fines, restitution, and probation, but the real punishment for Karen wasn't in the numbers or the legal jargon. It was in the loss of her power, her reputation, and her iron grip on the community. She was ordered to personally fund part of the creek's restoration, a cost so steep that she was forced to sell her beloved SUV and downsize her lifestyle drastically. Watching her walk out of that courthouse, shoulders hunched, face pale, no gaggle of followers behind her, I felt an odd sense of closure wash over me. She had stormed into my life like a hurricane, determined to bend me to her will, but in the end she had destroyed herself, undone not by my fists or my shouting, but by her own hubris and the unstoppable force of consequences catching up to her. For me, life at the cabin slowly returned to the peace I had sought when I first moved back. Mornings spent listening to the birdsong by the creek, afternoons repairing the cabin and tending to the land, evenings sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee as the water gurgled contentedly through its rightful channel. Neighbors who had once eyed me with suspicion now waved when they passed, some even stopping by to thank me for standing my ground against Karen. I didn't need their gratitude, but it was a reminder that doing the right thing, even when it's hard, can ripple outward in ways you don't always expect. As for Karen, the last I heard, she had moved out of the subdivision entirely too embarrassed to face the people she had once lorded over, retreating to a smaller place in another county where I suspected she would eventually find new victims for her need to control. But here in the valley, her reign was over, and the creek flowed free again, washing away the gravel and the memories of her meddling, leaving behind only the lesson that arrogance cannot damn the truth forever. With Karen finally gone, the valley seemed to breathe again, as though the land itself had been waiting for her departure to settle back into its natural rhythm. And for the first time since I had returned to the old cabin, I felt like I truly belonged here, not as some outsider fighting to defend my property, but as the rightful steward of the creek and the woods and the memories of my family that lingered in every pine needle and stone. The county brought in a restoration crew to help undo the damage she had caused, and I watched with quiet satisfaction as they hauled away the gravel, reshaped the banks, and planted new vegetation to stabilize the soil, their work guided by the same water inspector who had first seen through Karen's lies. He told me it would take time for the creek to fully recover, that ecosystems don't heal overnight, but he assured me that the flow was strong enough to bounce back and that nature had a way of reclaiming what belonged to it. He was right. Within weeks, the water ran clearer, the fish returned to the shallows, and dragonflies once again darted above the rippling surface. Even the subdivision, battered though it was by flooding and internal conflict, began to stabilize. Residents pooled resources to repair their irrigation pond, lawns gradually came back to life, and the new HOA board, stripped of Karen's tyranny, pledged to work with me instead of against me. It was strange to shake hands with people who had once glared at me from across the creek, but I could tell their hostility had never truly been about me. It had been about Karen's poison, her relentless insistence that I was the enemy. Now, free from her grip, they could see clearly, and some even offered apologies for the way they had treated me in the beginning. I accepted graciously because holding grudges would only weigh me down, and besides, I knew they had been victims of her manipulation just as I had. Still, I couldn't help but marvel at the irony of it all. Karen had wanted so badly to control the creek, to bend it and meter her will, and in the end, her meddling had only strengthened my bond with the community she had tried to use against me. I often wondered what became of her in that other county, whether she found another HOA to rule over, or whether she lived quietly, licking her wounds, too ashamed to start over in her old ways. Part of me hoped she had learned something from the ordeal, but the realist in me doubted it. People like Karen rarely change, because their need for control runs too deep, like an addiction, and yet, whether she changed or not no longer mattered to me, because her chapter in my story was closed. What mattered was the creek, the cabin, and the life I had rebuilt out here, a life that reminded me daily of my grandfather's wisdom. He had always said that the land has a way of teaching you if you're willing to listen, and I finally understood what he meant. The creek wasn't just water running over rocks. It was a mirror reflecting the truth of human nature, of arrogance and patience, of cause and effect. Karen had tried to block it, but the water had found a way, as it always does, just as the truth had found a way to cut through her lies. Sometimes, when I sat on the porch in the evening, I would imagine him sitting beside me, nodding in approval as the creek bubbled happily along, carrying with it not just water, but the memory of everything we had endured. And I would smile, because though Karen had left scars, they were healing, and in their place grew a stronger sense of belonging, of resilience, of justice fulfilled. The neighbors occasionally joked about putting up a plaque near the subdivision's pond, something like "In Memory of the Creek," but I always waved them off, not out of kindness to her, but because I didn't want her name etched into this place any longer. She had taken enough space in our lives, and now it was time to let the valley move on. In the end, what mattered wasn't her downfall, but the lesson she had inadvertently taught us all: that power without respect is hollow, that arrogance cannot stand against patience, and that when you try to dam up the natural course of things, whether it's water or truth, you will always be the one who gets swept away. Life went on as it always does, and with each season that passed, the creek grew stronger, carving its path deeper, whispering its eternal reminder that no one, not even an HOA Karen with a wheelbarrow full of gravel, can stop the flow of consequences forever.